Well, a very good morning. Glad you can all join us this morning. I hope it's a morning that finds you well. It seems as if there's sort of spring in the air, sense of optimism. So hopefully we'll carry that into this webinar. Really good panel to discuss the National Model Design Code. That's currently out for consultation at the moment until the 27th of March. Very much encourage you to either feed in your thoughts after the webinar, obviously participate, and in that regard, please, if you can, use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens rather than the chat function, and we'll try and pick up many of your questions as we go along. But we are going to have some presentations first and some reactions from our panelists. A word of introduction to each of them. Our main speaker is Andy von Bradsky. Andy is Head of Architecture at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I'm more likely to catch Andy as much on the trains as I am in the ministry, coming in from the same neck of the woods. Known Andy for several decades. And the one thing you can say about Andy is a total passion for a really well-designed and well-built environment. And so delighted to welcome him this morning to talk about the National Model Design Code. We've then got three panelists. The first is Lydia Firminger, who's got her mute on at the moment. She's working from Cape Town, and they have a big gun that goes off at midday there. So we won't ask her to come off mute at the moment, but Lydia has over 17 years of experience in design and delivery, prestigious residential mixed-use projects in central London, Europe and South Africa, and brings a particular focus on large-scale master plans that create vibrant destinations. Lydia, I know from conversations last week with her, has done a lot of work around Covent Garden, trying to bring underused buildings back into use, obviously very pertinent at this moment in time, the whole sort of repurposing agenda. So looking forward to Lydia's contributions. Our next panelist is Michela Hancock. Be well known to many of you. I think I sort of laid claim to being one of the first people that met Michela when she came over from the States. Gosh, it only seems like sort of yesterday, but probably is at least a decade, if not more, Michela. And Michela has been a huge sort of tour de force on the build-to-rent sector at Greystar Europe, where she's currently managing director. And really interested in sort of design, development, operational issues, and previous role as well as MD of Development and Construction for Greystar UK. Got a lot of experience on the construction side, planning, leasing up. So really glad to have that expertise on the panel this morning. And then our final panelist is Dominic Scott, who's a partner at Barton Wilmore. Dominic in Gloucestershire at the moment, but day job is on master plan and urban design and partner at Barton Wilmore, and really just the kind of person that we want on the panel today. Has a lot of experience in creation of design codes in master planning, been doing that for 20 years. And much of that work is, although sort of private sector facing, involves discussion, liaison, consultation with local authority officers who are critical to the topic that we have under discussion today. So that's our panel. I'm now going to ask Andy to spend about 15 minutes providing an introduction to the National Model Design Code, and then we'll have 3 or 4 minutes for each of our panelists. And Andy's going to share his screen with us in the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. Shame we can't see faces, but maybe later in the year we'll get back to some kind of personal exchanges. Anyway, this is one of a number of presentations that I've been given since the announcement of the National Model Design Code back at the end of January. I'm hoping you can see my screen. Am I okay with that, Ian?
Yes, you are, Andy. Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant. So yeah, one of a number of presentations that I've been giving to different sectors, different professions, around what amounts to a very significant announcement by ministers at the end of January. You may recall January 29th, we announced, firstly, the government's response to Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report, which had been published a year previously. And it picked up quite a number of issues to do with design in terms of how government responded to that report. That included changes to the NPPF and the launch of the National Model Design Code, and included other announcements, including Office for Place and pilots. And I'll touch on each of these as I go through the presentation. The first thing to say is that the amendments to the NPPF are mopping up some of the issues that were raised by the 4Bs and C report in terms of reflecting design quality and beauty as a more strategic objective within the planning system. The expectation that local authorities will produce design codes, it's always been part of policy for that to happen, but it's been further emphasised. There will be other issues that you'll find within the document. It's all in track changes on gov.uk. I've no doubt most of you will have already looked over this and decided on how you think you might respond to it. And the response is due on the 27th of March, so in a couple of weeks' time. The announcement of these changes actually brings together a suite of documents that are now representative of government's view of what quality design means. The National Model Design Code completes a package of planning practice guidance, which includes design, process and tools, the National Design Guide, and now the National Model Design Code and guidance notes. And they all sit together as a suite, should be read together, and are effectively material consideration in planning decisions. This is a very significant step for the planning system to embrace this particular suite of documents, and probably is the biggest move to strengthen design quality in the planning system in 10 years or so. These are the two documents that were published. You'll find them again on gov.uk. They are effectively for use by local planning authorities to produce their own local design codes and to consider design quality within their local plans. It's effectively a toolkit. It's not a code in itself that is transposed on local authorities. There's actually a methodology and guidance notes to create codes, which then get included in local plans or SPDs. I'll sort of draw your attention at this point to say that this doesn't preempt anything to do with the planning reform agenda. It is for the current planning system, not for the future planning system. Obviously, they'll be learning from it, but it will inform what planning reform might be, but is not intended to be representative of it. It sets out a process for capturing the views of local communities, and I would argue that the guidance notes in particular represent probably the biggest step since the Urban Design Compendium, and set out more specifically what good urban design is about, and can be used much more intensely in assessing planning applications that come forward. The documents set out design parameters that local planning authorities and communities then need to decide what good quality design looks like for its area. It effectively sets out the objectives in the front part of the document, so creating healthy, environmentally responsive, greener, sustainable and distinctive places, those sort of issues being embraced. And it refers back and links to the National Design Guide, which published back in October 19, actually sets out the 10 characteristics of well-designed places. So it effectively builds on a document that already exists and sets out government's view what good design means. It's intended to be used at different scales and in different types of context, and effectively to give developers and communities more certainty. And the objective over time will be to invest early to speed up the process later on. The guidance notes actually include lots of reference to or defer to other documents that are advisory. Manual for Streets, of course, is being reworked at the moment and will form part of a suite of documents to which the guidance notes refer. The green infrastructure standards coming forward will also reflect in the guidance notes, and other cross-government departments have inputted into this, as well as Historic England, Natural England, and some of those other agencies. How design coding is applied is going to be a matter for local planning authorities to decide. It could be for a code for the whole of the local planning authority, it could be for an area within the planning authority, or it could be, as we currently have it, for large scale or even smaller scale development sites. So it could be applied in different ways and flexibly according to local circumstances. And the level of detail that goes into codes, again, is going to be subject to what local planning authorities feel is right for their area. The code itself is a process. As I've said, it's not something that's transposed on local authorities. It's a methodology, and it's 7 steps over 3 broad categories. So understanding the nature of an area, having a vision for that area, and then coding for that area all becomes a part of that methodology. So the first stage almost needs to be understanding how to consult on this, whether it's with communities, with developers, landowners, and how that engagement process is intended to be structured, timetabled, and indeed any training that might need to go alongside that. Within the code document, you will see reference to the 10 characteristics of well-designed places with the same colour referencing. Design codes would normally include at least 7 of those 10 characteristics, which we've listed here. But for complete standards and longevity and environmental issues, which are often not in themselves part of a code, we've included those 3 aspects that might not normally be included, just to ensure that there is this completeness of the approach to quality. Under each of those 10, there are a series of parameters which are listed out here. These are the things that within the code and the guidance notes can be more specifically described and given a specific measure or a specific requirement. You can't read them all, but it's a pretty comprehensive picture which covers all aspects of that particular characteristic. Baseline information, this is really areas understanding the nature of their place. And a lot of places already have this sort of mapping or this GIS information. And so we're suggesting that this is fundamental in terms of coding and understanding the character, the nature, the topography, the site details. All of that is essential baseline information to build up a design code. A design vision is really not just what a place is at the moment, i.e. the baseline, but also what it then wants to become into the future. So the design vision is understanding the nature of the context as it exists, and then developing an idea of what you want it to be into the future, and involving communities and having a vision for that particular part of development. Coding plans are a sort of requirement within the methodology to actually sort of map out what a local authority or what an area contains in terms of types of development. We've listed out what we call area types here. and 10 area types, which range from inner city to rural settlements and villages and everything in between, including urban, suburban neighbourhoods, local centres. Now, there could be more than 10. It's going to be contingent on how an area, how a local authority assesses its area. But the idea is to map that and to identify the nature of the character of an area. The white blobs within this plan are large-scale development sites that could be in themselves a series of area types, but actually map out what those allocated sites are and how they might be developed into the future. Master planning is an essential requirement for this process, and I suppose developers will always include master plans and three-dimensional images for their coding process, and it's no different in our view for local authorities to do the same, to map this out. And this needs to include a whole series of requirements that effectively form the framework for development, the parameters for development within an area. The area types in themselves can be much more clearly identified and given a sort of a metric, or given a sort of yes/no answers or some specific requirements. And we've listed out here just 3 of the area types that we refer to. And we've demonstrated where those requirements, those design parameters, which you referred to earlier, might be. So density, building height, building line, setback, all those issues can be effectively made a requirement and done quite simply, and given a sort of very clear impression of what a design code ought to include. Guidance notes to area types is mapped out in the first volume. The image on the right actually brings together a whole series of requirements that are illustrated in a visual way, and other sort of explanations of what those requirements need to be on the left-hand side. So the document's well illustrated. It gives a sort of very sort of accessible and well illustrated guide to how to use the design parameters in different circumstances. There might be code-wide guidance, so not just for an area type, but for a whole code. And for example, here we set out the biodiversity design principles and how that might apply to not just a single area type, but a whole code, which include multiple area types. I won't go into the guidance notes document. If you've seen it, it's a voluminous piece of work with lots of information and illustrations, which give the local authority an indication of the kind of best practice images that you might expect. So some very clear urban design principles, which will be totally familiar to developers and to consultants and urban designers who sort of understand this, this particular work, but it brings it all together into a single place. It's style neutral, so it's not actually promoting any kind of architectural style. It's very pick and mix and not prescriptive in terms of its application. Just finally on the community engagement, I just wanted to come back on that particular point. Government talks about bringing democracy forward into the planning system and into plan making. So this is a step towards doing that. So how local design codes are developed in detail will be subject to how well communities engage in that process. So we've included guidance on the techniques and the approaches to that. And there are some really good examples out there of having done that well. And we just want to mainstream some of that good work that many architects, urban designers, landscape architects actually use in terms of engaging communities. But added to that, the digital experience that we've had over the last year in particular, and how do we get social media involved in that? How do we use visualization techniques that enable people to engage? And how do we reach more diverse younger age groups and so on in that whole process? So we're looking to identify how best local authorities can do that, what's good practice, and indeed how you measure the support. You know, how do we know that a design code is agreed by a local community? The final slide from me is just around next steps and where we are now. I mentioned about the consultation period ending on 27th March. So if you have comments against the NPPF and the National Model Design Code, there is an opportunity for you to do that. We expect some comment on both. I've certainly heard lots of feedback already about the kind of issues that are going to be quoted back to us. So we look forward to the discussion in a minute about that. We are also doing a testing program, which is effectively taking the code work, giving some grant to local planning authorities and asking them to test aspects of the code. We'll be following that up with further pilots later in the spring, once we've made any changes to the code work and the NPPF. We recognise the importance of the training and bringing up to speed local planning authorities in understanding how to do this work. So Office for Place specifically focused around how do you implement design coding more widely within the planning system. So we hope by the end of the period over the next few months that there will be a few precedents for local design codes and testing programs to share with everybody. Thank you very much. That's me finished. I'll stop sharing now, Ian, and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. And yeah, great to see that it's being piloted. Don't think we do enough of that in the policy world. And we were discussing last week amongst the panelists that it's a really well-designed document. It's very accessible and very, I think, user-friendly for those that are experts in this area, but for those that are not. So I think certainly a tick in the box for getting a really, I think, accessible document. We're going to. We've got 3 questions already coming through. So those have not been forgotten. I will come to those, but we'll go around our panel first, and firstly to Lydia to react.
Hi, thanks. I've been scribbling lots of notes here. So first reactions is that overall, I think it's a really positive tool with huge amount of merits, if used as I believe it is intended to be used, as Andy has described. I think the standardized template is a really good thing, so that perhaps we as architects aren't all writing our own individual framework documents. So really it sort of becomes a shared language. I'm imagining a common springboard for conversations with local authorities, stakeholders, the community, which means that I suppose sites can be judged against similar criteria, albeit each project will inevitably be crafted and designed on an individual basis. So I think most architects would agree with all design guidance through all the years. It's there to refer to, but to be applied as we think best suits the project and provides the best solution and highest level of design to each specific situation, whether that's an individual building, block of flats, a master plan, piece of public realm. So I suppose it leads me to the only one concern maybe that I had, that it doesn't become too rigid and too much of a tick box exercise, and that I think the danger is that there could be certain fads or fashions with design, such as if there's a series of successful consents that too rigidly is a translation of the design in terms of the building design. I mean, the last thing we want really, is what I'm saying, is that for all buildings and places or spaces to look the same. So it's not meant to be used in that way. So I think, I mean, I strongly believe as a designer, and as we do as a company, that each building has got to be judged on an individual basis, and that ultimately the thing that makes good design isn't an absolute code, but it's a lot more the sort of qualitative aspects, especially now, obviously post-COVID, and the fact that people are so much more focused on well-being, green spaces, community aspects, the on-site amenity spaces, especially obviously with build to rent, as opposed to the more definitive and absolute measurements of space. So I think just in summary, just from listening to Andy there, it could be an extremely successful tool in the planning process, but very much has to be transparency between all parties, developer, client, design team, planning, and obviously the local community. And that must happen at the early stages. So I guess the word is collaboration here. And I really look forward to seeing how this actually, the actual process materializes in reality. But from my perspective, and I think our company's perspective, we see it very much as a positive string to our bow as designers.
Thanks very much, Lydia. So continuing the positivity that I'd wanted to bring to this this webinar, and yeah, you've made some really good points there, I think, in terms of encouraging variety, context, and that point on collaboration. And we're now going to hear from Michela, who is going to give this a developer's perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Ian, and great to see everyone today. I thought it was really, I think it's incredibly well written. As a developer reading through it, I think it was easy to understand, which I think is a real positive. We're, as Greystar, we're incredibly supportive of this National Model Design Code. We believe in a well-designed place. That's the ethos that we look at our communities through. So we're always looking at principles of a well-designed place. How will our residents and how will our communities, how will they feel to live in? Because as a long-term operator, we're not just looking at today, but we're looking at what it would be in 5 and 10 years. And as operators of build to rent and student housing, we're really interested in that community engagement piece. So I think I found a real positive was the focus on the genuine community engagement and how that would happen. So giving guidance on the techniques like the workshops and the design charrettes and how to make it accessible for people, I think is really important. I think that can be a big challenge, is bringing the local community in and getting their engagement and then turning that into kind of the practical feedback that goes back into the codes. I think looking at how we practically use this document from a developer's perspective, it's talked about being used by local authorities. I think we also need to realize there will be more collaboration between the local authorities and the developers and the landowners. And I think it is a real positive. I think having that design vision and the government's focus on that, that is important, I think will really help, I think, to kind of level up the quality nationally. So I think it's a massive positive. I think one of the things I think that Lydia mentioned was the flexibility of the need for this to remain flexible. Again, as developers out there, those of you in the audience, you know that the one constant is that things are always changing. So I think the ability to be flexible as we're developing these codes, also it must be practical and deliverable. So talking about resources, do we have the capability, the capacity, and the skills across all the local authorities? And I think that's something that we'll need to work through as a group and as an industry. I also think it's important to note that this process shouldn't add more time to the delivery of much needed homes and sites. And I think if we all work together on this, that it will remain a positive. I think, overall, that it is very important that we have this community engagement and we bring in the local community. So I would just say that from a long-term operator and developer's perspective, that this is very positive. I think that we value good design, we value personal relationships with our team and our communities, and this is just another kind of, I think, factor in that, is that it really is being encouraged at the government level. So I think we see it as extremely positive, and I'm really interested to see what comes out of this. So one of the examples I'll be talking about a little bit later is our project Greenford, which is our 26-acre site in Ealing. And a lot of these principles, I think, are very relevant to what we did there. So again, building a 2,000 unit community there that's mixed use. And it will be a long-term community for us. So really important. I think a lot of the things that were talked about in the code really resonate, especially around the sustainability and the lifestyle in terms of health and well-being. So again, really, really interested in this conversation today, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes.
Thanks, Michelle. And I know you've had a steady stream of visitors to Greenford. Yeah, great place that you're building there. So I'm sure we'd like to find out more as we get into discussion. And passing finally to our last but not least, Dominic, who's, as I said at the start, from the sort of planning side, Barton Wilmore. Appreciate your views, Dominic.
Thank you, Ian, and hello, everyone. A third positive comment from me. I think as a practice, we always welcome any initiative or guidance that helps raise the quality of the built environment and puts placemaking at the center, the heart of everything we do. And I don't think many people on the call will be surprised to hear that. Andy was very clear in his run through. In my notes, I'd said, it's about process, it's about the toolkit, it's primarily aimed at local authorities. And I thought where it started to get really interesting was sort of page 4, paragraph 19, where it says the document should be used as a basis for the production of design codes and guides by local planning authorities. So it's quite specific there. With local communities, 3 options. With local communities, local authorities may collaborate with developers and landowners. And then finally, developers and landowners may choose to prepare their own design codes as part of a planning application. So it's quite a broad offer, if you like, there. And I think that's right and proper. I think in terms of developers putting together design codes, we're seeing more and more in the last couple of years of codes being brought forward at outline planning application stage. I think there is some reticence amongst our clients that the local authorities have the necessary skills and resources. It's been mentioned by the other speakers. I know it's appeared on other webinars. I know Andrew Taylor from Countryside mentioned it. And it is one of those issues which we can't get away from, and consultants are partly culpable. We go to a meeting, we go to a workshop, we see a good professional, and the first thing we do is offer them a job. So we as consultants are partly responsible for some of that perhaps drain. I would say though that in the last few years I've worked with some really good local authority urban designers, Steve Wilkinson at Rotherham, more recently Mark Harris down at South Hams in Devon. Great professionals, really nice people to work with. So they are there, but there are not that many of them. And I think there is a rebalance required in our professional situation to encourage more of us to sit on that side of the fence, as it were. There's certainly been an increased public engagement on design codes. We've got some good examples. Doesn't happen all the time, but of course the projects vary considerably. The code for and the engagement for an individual building or set of buildings in London will be very different from 3,000 units in South Devon. I think the key to it, and I think Lydia did mention it already, was collaboration. Very often the creation of the code process with the local authority has been very adversarial. Developer wants maximum flexibility, local authority want as much instruction as possible. And rightly or wrongly, you end up with quite a negotiation, and it's quite an adversarial thing. So I hope that one of the things that comes out of this piece of guidance is that everyone takes it positively and that collaboration and trust are increased. I think the point about the vision is absolutely crucial. You have to establish that first. And I would go, I think, beyond some of the commentary already, which is, ask yourselves with the authority, who lives there? Why are they living there? Where do they work? You know, you have to answer those questions and have buy-in from all parties, including the public, if you're going to then produce a truly collaborative piece of work. I suppose the question that I asked myself really was, what is the impact on the development industry? And I think the answer to that is, it comes down to a consideration of two elements. One is timing, which again has been mentioned, and the other is certainty. Currently we have, well, certainly for greenfield and out of urban master planning work, we have 4 stages: site allocation, outline application, code probably as a condition of the outline, and reserve matters. I think the suggestion, both within this document and sort of more generally, is that that coding work comes further forward, is brought forward in the process, in the timing of the process. And I think that could be a good thing if it gives developers more certainty. That's what they're asking for in many discussions, whether it's about this code or other elements of guidance and policy. So if the task can be completed with authorities, with collaboration, efficiently, then I think it's a glass half full scenario. However, we know that if we bring that process forward, that there will be more time and therefore more cost earlier on in the process. There's no return yet for the developer. So I think as long as the process can happen efficiently and collaboratively and everyone sees a benefit, then it's a good thing. I think we just have to be careful we don't end up in a glass half empty scenario where it becomes counterproductive because it's just seen as another piece of process. It's seen as another piece of bureaucracy. I have to say that personally, I'm very positive about it, partly because it's been written very clearly, as you rightly say, as we talked about before, and partly because it is the right thing to do. And I hope that local authorities respond very positively to it, and that even if they are perhaps a little bit short of skill and resource, that they find a way to be positive with it. So a third positive message from my point of view, Ian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and a clear message there, I think, to developers and all those involved in the process to be proactive, and that came across strongly. We've got 5 questions now. We've got a couple in the chat, so I'm going to go straight to questions because we've got about 22 minutes left. And I think Claire was the first to ask a question, so I'll maybe roll that up with one that we discussed earlier, perhaps as well, which is one for Dominic, I think, and Andy, the planning status of this document. And then Claire's question is there a deadline for councils to get their master planning completed?
Well, I'm happy to kick off. Thank you very much to all the 3 speakers for some really interesting feedback and positivity generally. Glass full, I would have said, Dominic, never mind half full. I just wanted to sort of come back on a few points, but I can do that later after the sort of questions. Just in terms of its status in the planning system, it is still planning practice guidance. So it's not policy, it's not a requirement to use this code, but I think the NPPF makes it very clear that local planning authorities are expected to use it and to use the National Design Guide to inform local design codes, but it is guidance still. Was there a secondary to that question, Ian? Can't remember.
Yes, it was from Claire just asking, is there a deadline for councils to get their master planning completed? I presume.
Yeah, so this came up, I think, as part of the planning white paper. There was a reference to all local planning authorities needing to have done this in 3 years. That isn't the current government position on this. I think we will find out from the piloting work, you know, the amount of time, the extent, the coverage that's needed, but there isn't any sort of preset timescale for delivering at the moment.
Anybody else want to come in on Dominic? Yeah.
I was just going to agree with Andy that I think the guidance is very, that the document is very clear. Page 1 starts off with a statement, and it's very clear that it is the guidance is not a statement of national policy. However, the government recommends that the advice, and I think it's very clear in that sense. I think the second question about the master planning, I mean, every project is so different that, you know, the master plan is not a singular moment in time. It needs to be something that is created by collaborative, by all. You know, there's always somebody with the pen, admittedly, perhaps me, perhaps Lydia, but there is, you know, it is not something which is a static element, and therefore developing the vision, developing the master plan, and having the ability to continue to develop the master plan, I think, is really important for this. But equally, if you're going to code something, you've got to have something to code, and therefore you always have to put a line in the sand at a particular moment. But I wouldn't like people to think that it is a completely flat line that you work to there. I think it's got to be something that evolves.
Thank you, Dominic. Trying to be fair and do these in order. So I think the next question that came in was from an anonymous attendee, and they were asking about the prevalence of local design codes already. How many local authorities have these, and you know, could you give any examples, perhaps good, you know, good practice that are out there already? Perhaps Lydia, Dominic, or Andy for that one.
I'm happy to go first. I think across the country it's a really mixed bag, if I'm being very honest. I think some authorities have are highly skilled and have professionals in place and are creating their own code work, and other places are desperate for resource and come to the consultancies for that. I think there is some great examples. I mean, one of the things that I always get passionate about is the fact that, you know, a code shouldn't be a detailed set of instructions. It should be about strategies and principles. It should be about setting those key design moves, and that can then, as Andy rightly said earlier, can be interpreted perhaps using the architects, landscape architects, engineers' creativity. And I think what we're seeing is, certainly my experience down in Devon working with Mark Harris was that let's create a site-wide design code that goes with the outline planning application, and that is only about strategies and principles. It almost sets the specification for further area design codes when we will start to be more specific about some of that design detail. And to be able to have that conversation with Mark, with our clients, and understand why we're doing that, to me, is the essence of this. Having that discussion and understanding why we're doing that, and everyone saying, that's a good idea, let's do that. Great job. We can then move forward very positively. Thank
you. I'm happy to, yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, you go ahead, Andy, and then I'll bring in Michela.
No, I was just going to say it is a patchwork quilt across the country, really. Some places really embracing the principle of coding anyway, regardless of our guidance, and others sort of left behind. And I think it's the low value areas that often sort of lack the sort of the confidence and the often the capability within their local authorities to actually deliver coding work themselves. So yeah, I'd agree. It's mixed. There is one area in particular in London Borough of Hounslow is embracing this piece of work really well, and we had a presentation from their team the other day, which actually demonstrated how it can be applied in a London context, which is actually quite a much more difficult context to do coding in. So yeah, point people to that one as an example.
And Michela, you wanted to come in and perhaps also pick up the next question as well, which was about engagement with the community, and when a developer is going to do that in a more active way, perhaps you could bring in your experiences as well.
Or I wanted to just make a comment. I thought one of the questions was really interesting about, could local authorities generate a consortium of architects, developers, planners, and local authorities to form their design codes? And I know a lot of us have mentioned the challenges around the capacity and the resources and skills within the local authorities, and it does vary. But I guess my question was a bit more for the panel itself and maybe to Andy, but do you think that could be a way of getting around the capacity issues in some local authorities? I guess that's sort of a question for the panel maybe to discuss, but I was quite interested in that. And then,
so I'd like to come back on this collaboration point, because I think it covers quite a number of the points the speakers were talking about, and probably the interests of your members as well. I mean, I didn't emphasize it enough, and perhaps I should have done, that whole point about, you know, drawing from the skills from the sector, from developers who are already doing it, from architects who really understand the nature of coding and also the nature of engagement. So local authorities ought not to feel that they're alone in this. In fact, if they don't collaborate with developers in the right way early on, it could lead to coding that doesn't actually work for their particular area. So I think that engagement and that collaboration is such an important point, and I'm glad all three speakers raised it. I think developers who do this well will actually go above and beyond what's actually set out, and, you know, think in more detail, and might actually come up with greater requirements than might be set out in the model code, which would be welcome. It's just how places work together with the developers in their area.
Lydia, you'd wanted to come in.
No, I was just sort of sharing my experience of local authorities in London, which perhaps are far more equipped than other places around the UK, which is Dominic's point. I mean, for example, I mean, Westminster works very closely with framework documents, for example, with architects and developers, and that has been a great collaboration on past projects. But it's just how that can happen across the board. And actually, how does that happen, which was one of my initial thoughts early on, and whose cost? Is it at the sort of developer's cost, which is maybe what Michela was going to touch upon as well?
And I wanted to answer Ian's question to me as well about when will developers start engaging with the community, and, you know, is this something that would be required as part of the planning application? I think in a lot of local authorities it is, and the earlier the better, that, you know, the earlier engagement. I think, as we've said, like, there's a range of different capabilities and skills out there, and there's also a range of different, I think, the way that you approach community engagement. So I think, you know, I know as Greystar, we take it very seriously, and we like as early engagement as possible, because we just think that that makes for a better project. Again, we're developing for the long term, and we're there managing on site long term. So I think it's just, it kind of varies as to how you look at your developments. And we look at place as, you know, very long term. We're not looking at going in and then kind of not being there day two, but we're there for, you know, over 10 years. So I think it's, or longer, it's a very different way of looking at the community as a whole, and we really want to fit in with the community. So I think it just depends on the ethos of the developer, but I think it really should be encouraged at a very early stage.
And Dominic, you'd, what's your experience of developers?
Yeah, I think, to pick up Andy's point, that there is a degree of positivity out there. I've got an example at Linmere, at Houghton Regis, with lands improvements, 5,000 units, where a code was agreed with the local authority, a very positive, good code, good piece of work. And then immediately afterwards, the developer actually created their own version of the code, a kind of evolved Mark II. And the reason they did that is not because they didn't believe in the first version, but simply because they wanted to start adding some certainty to things like the material. So if there's a red brick and there are 3 developers working cheek by jowl, let's have a discussion with them and agree which that red brick is, and then sign up to that. So again, there's a bit of collaboration in that. It's not just stick, it's working together, talking together, and agreeing together. And I think there are some great examples. That Linmere example, we did consultation on the outline, we did consultation on the site-wide design code, and then we did consultation on the individual area design codes. And at that late stage, we moved one of the primary schools, because the headmistress of the local school came in and said, I think you could build it next to mine on rather than putting it in the center of your scheme, and we'll join the two schemes together and run them together. And, I think you have to be in that mindset if you're going to take maximum advantage out of the ability to collaborate and talk with people and engage with people. So all positive, I think, all positive direction for me.
Pick up Jeremy's question, as it's quite pertinent. The last time I attended the Property Week Resi conference, there was a very sparky session where I think the editor of the Architects Journal went off on one, shall we say, and it's this sort of weighing up the design coding against the government's agenda on delivering beauty, and to what extent are they sort of supporting each other or getting in the way of each other. I'll leave the second part of Jeremy's question because I think others have sort of asked similar questions. I'll pick that up later. But yeah, how does this sort of design code sit with the broader agenda and that government's been pursuing on beauty?
Yeah, I'll come in here. I'm very happy to. I mean, the use of the word beauty in the documents is quite limited. So it's the first point to make, although you make reference to it. It's right up front, and it's not used in liberal terms. The issue for me as an architect is that there isn't anything necessarily wrong with the word. It's just how do you define what you mean by it, and that's the sort of subjective bit that gets often asked. And the coding work and the design principles that sit behind that are in the guide. If you do all that well, it will lead to good design outcomes. I prefer the word well designed as opposed to beauty, but effectively, if you apply the principles in the right way, it will lead to what you might describe as beautiful places. So I think architects tend to sort of feel some sort of recoil against the use of the word. I think they should embrace it and just seek to use the documents to produce well-designed places, and use that terminology if they're uncomfortable with beauty.
Okay, nobody else wants to come in on that.
No, I was just going to agree. I mean, I have similar notes here, but I mean, that beauty is entirely subjective, and it's the philosophy of those 10 key criteria that sort of underpins the word beauty. And I mean, I just think that architects often use the word delight, but if we, as you say, stick to these points, perhaps that's something that does come by matter of.
Yeah, it's what's the old saying? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. There's science here as well in terms of the coding, which sets out, I think, in detail how you can design well-designed places. Next question I'm going to take from the chat, because there was a couple came in there, and that was from I think Will McKee, who was saying that places sit next to other places, and so in that sort of process that you set out, Andy, where different areas are defined, how do you deal with the sort of friction between different areas where you're sort of transitioning from one area to the next, and in terms of design coding? Dominic, perhaps, have you got a view on?
It's an interesting question, I have to say, and not one that I perhaps really thought too much about until the question was raised. But I think, again, it comes back to, the more people that are involved, the more inclusive it is, then the less likely that is going to be an issue. But equally, the more people you've got involved, the more complicated, the more timely, and perhaps the more costly it becomes. So there will clearly be a balance in that. But it just reminds me a little bit about the local authority boundaries and duty to cooperate, and those authorities that don't cooperate and then dump across a boundary. I hope we don't get into that situation. I think the intention as set out is very clear, so I hope we don't get into that difficult, well, it's fallen down the middle or we've got overlap situation here.
Michela, you must have had experience of this with sort of doing large developments in existing places. So.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking of some of my experiences from both the US and the UK, and more specifically, I think Greenford, because again, we're building, it's a 26 acre site where we've done a complete master plan community with mixed use and 2,000 units. So again, bringing in, a new development into an existing community, and we tried to be very sensitive to the local context and to design something that would enhance the surroundings. But I think one of the big key elements for us was to continue that community engagement. So we actually have a community and events manager on site as part of our site team that runs events, obviously not now in person, but virtual, but she does events for the local community and our residents throughout the lifespan of the development. So again, continuing to bring that collaboration and communication to the local community, because I think that's really important as you build different developments that are coming into the existing surroundings. I think it's about that constant feedback loop and taking feedback of the residents and of the local community into account. So I think that for me is that communication, the collaboration, I think all the things we've touched on in this panel, but it's important to keep that going throughout the construction and the lifespan of the development.
There's, I guess, also questions around skills, around capacity of local authorities, and how we deal with that. Obviously, to some extent, you touched on it with collaboration, pooling resources. Anybody want to come in on either of those questions, skills or capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fully recognised that local authorities, many local authorities, not entirely equipped for that. And I think that, again, that this sort of patchy nature of the skills around the country is recognised. Office for Place is set up, as I mentioned before, or is being set up to address that. And it's trying to embrace a bit of learning about what skills are available around the country. We have Design Network, Design Council, a whole series of design service providers who can sort of support local authorities to deliver that. You've got Public Practice, a really good organisation that's trying to help local authorities with urban design skills. So that's all good. But I think part of the challenge moving forward will be to identify where the gaps are, the left behind places that might not have any skills at all. And our coding work, I think, will sort of help flush some of that out, and we'll be working with Office for Place in terms of understanding the learning. But I go back to that collaboration point. I think working together with developers and architects who actually understand design coding is going to be the reality, I think, of many of the design code work that comes forward. So time will tell, and it's in government's mind to address. So watch this space.
And just to sort of picking up skills and capacity in the private sector, is that equally equipped, Lydia, Dominic, to rise to this?
I would say so. Yes, I think we've spent many number of years, haven't we, refining our craft and our trade, and I think we know what makes good places. I think the interesting thing for me is the dynamism that is out there in terms of sustainability agenda, health and well-being. The way people live, the way people work. That is a very fast-moving landscape that we're sitting this into, and I don't think we should be frightened of that. And I do think that consultants are well placed to deliver on this. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I believe it's true.
Yeah, no, I mean, I very much agree with Dominic. I've worked a lot in the sort of private sector. Obviously, it's just as you say, there is a whole different landscape that we're now in post-COVID, and so it will inevitably change. But I very much think we're geared up to do that. We're
just about out of time, so maybe take a comment from Michela, who's off mic there, and then I shall come to each of our panelists and just ask you for one final thought, positive or negative, about the new model design code.
I was just going to say about the capacity. I think, as Andy mentioned, I think it's really important to identify where the gaps are currently and what skills do we need, and then how can we partner with the private sector and consultants, potentially these consortiums that someone asked about in the question and answer. But I think it's really important to note that we need to do this as a group. Again, collaboration, I think, is the best way for a positive outcome on this.
Thank you, Michela. So let's go in reverse order. Shall we start with Dominic? And one final thought on the code, Dominic.
Yeah, I'd originally planned to perhaps congratulate Andy on the accessibility of the document. I think many of the documents recently have been much more accessible, as you rightly said, Ian. But let me do it slightly differently then. I hope that it helps to create trust across the public-private interface. I think if it can help make a big inroad into that, then it'll have been a great piece of work. So thank you.
Great point. Thank you, Dominic. Lydia.
Along the same lines again as Dominic, but I think the legibility of the document, I really enjoyed the clarity of the diagrams and graphics, which I think really communicate a strong message to everyone, not just professionals in the construction industry.
And Michela.
I think for me, the takeaway is that the government is committed to good quality design and well-designed places. And I think improving the housing delivery and raising up the standards of design nationally is really important. And so for me, it's a very positive code.
I don't know if you want a final word, Andy, but if you
Yeah.
have a strong
Well, thank you very much for really kind words. I have to give credit to Urbed, who were our partner in that, and to all the collaborators. There was an enormous amount of input from different parts of the sector in making this, and we had lots of challenge and lots of iterations of the document. And I'm glad that it's turned out the way it has. I mean, I think my final point was this point about skills, and this is a real opportunity for the planning system to be proactive in terms of the kind of places it wants. We need more skilled people in local authorities, and more architects, more urban designers. We need those place makers to actually be taking over the planning system and being, creating really well-designed places from the outset, rather than just dealing with planning as a process. It needs to be thinking about the output in a very proactive way. And we need, good skills in local planning authorities. End of, that's the final word from me.
My apologies for not being able to get through everybody's questions. In many ways, I think that's a good indication, however, of the interest in this topic. As I said at the start, if you've got points of view that you want to express on the National Model Design Code, please either feed in by the 27th to MHCLG, or if you remember, come through ourselves. Sam and the team here is pulling together our response at the moment. We'd much appreciate your feedback. A few thank yous. Thank you to the attendees this morning, and your contributions. It's been very welcome. To Sam and Gail from the home team, who helped pull the event together, and then to our panel, who have you've kept on their toes in terms of all those questions coming through, and some excellent answers for them. Thank you very much to all of them for joining us this morning. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.